So welcome to Jacksonville Hadassah's Summer Book Reviews, and I am really delighted that everybody is here. I really only have one quick announcement, Goldie, if I may, and that we mentioned Sandra Resnikoff is not able to be with us today, but she reminds us that you can still get cards and certificates. If we were meeting in person, you know, she would have her table of such a great variety of Hadassah greeting cards, birth, mazel tov, wedding, there's New Year's cards, there's lots and lots of cards. Thinking of you, I give her, unfortunately, a lot of business with condolence cards. So please remember to give her a call, and I'm going to put her number in the chat box later so you can call. She is receiving people at home until we're back in person to get cards and certificates, and we would really appreciate you thinking of that. It's a small but mighty way to support our Hadassah chapter. And Gloria Einstein, I'm going to send it, I'm going to take it, let you take it over from here and get us started, and looking forward to today's book review.
I was told I should have a Hadassah moment, and I actually have something I really want to talk about Hadassah. It's a recent development, the long COVID clinic at Hadassah Hospital. If anyone wants to think back to the spring of 2020, physicians and scientists all over the world were trying to come to grips with this pandemic and its many aspects. But one thing physicians by and large were not doing is responding to patients who had symptoms long after they presumably recovered from COVID, a whole variety of symptoms, but they were very persistent and they were severe in some cases. And the way this finally got noticed is people got together online. They called themselves long haulers and began to define the problem, but it did not come from our medical system. But Hadassah physicians in the spring of 2020 began noticing and documenting the patients who had these kinds of problems. By October 2020, Hadassah Hospital had organized the long COVID clinic with physicians and other health professionals from many specialties. This was written up, if you want to learn more, in the Hadassah magazine of March 2021. And what they do is the interface of research and treatment. They respond to the symptoms, they try to bring relief, but at the same time, they're documenting and doing research about what really causes this and what to do about it. So it's something that makes me very, very proud to be a Hadassah member. It's my great pleasure today to introduce today's book reviewer, my friend, Carole Feldman. Carole has had a much more adventurous life than most of us. Many of us have traveled a lot of the world, but Carole has lived and worked in Australia, England, France, Indonesia, and many parts of the US. Not only that, when she and Marvin travel for pleasure, they travel independently and adventurously, a combination of advanced planning and the flexibility they need to utilize the military transport available because of Marvin's retired Air Force status. Carole's fluency in French and Indonesian Malay and her aptitude for related languages has opened up much of Europe and Asia to them. Their approach to travel is to see what's around the next corner, and they've made many fascinating discoveries. They've also made lasting friends on their travels who have invited them back for visits and events. They document their travels and have had numerous articles in various travel publications, guiding and inspiring others to travel as they do. Carole has worked professionally as a teacher, translator, editor, conference coordinator, and nonprofit administrator. Her most unique job was as the protocol officer and social secretary of the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. She was moving to Jakarta, and in preparation for going there, she had talked her way into the Defense Language School, a rapid and thorough program for learning languages. In Jakarta, she was working for a nonprofit which organized a program to familiarize foreigners with Indonesia and applied for the embassy job. It was her responsibility to deal with the cultural differences and to interpret between Indonesian. She organized functions and social events, and these occurred every day. It was part of her job to attend after working all day organizing them. After a year in that high-pressure job, she knew so many people in the Indonesian government that she was successful in promoting foreign business development there. She's also an amazing cook, hostess, and dressmaker. I learned from Carole that when she lived in Australia, they don't have Hadassah, or they didn't at the time. Instead, the Jewish women belonged to the Women's Zionist Organization. Carole became a life member of Hadassah when she and Marvin lived in Honolulu, where they met, and where she was actively involved in the Hawaii chapter of Hadassah. Marvin is an associate member of Hadassah. Carole and Marvin have lived in Jacksonville since 2004 after having moved here from Perth, Western Australia. And I'm eagerly looking forward to this book review. Thank you, Carole.
Oh, Gloria, many thanks. Gosh, I didn't realize I'd done all those things. Thank you. That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you. First picture, please, Helen. And good morning to everybody here.
Carole, I have the slide up. Do you see it?
Not exactly the way we saw it before, but whatever you can do, that's probably good enough, I guess. Well, good morning, everybody. The picture that you see here is the cover of The Golden Age. There is another cover. I'm not really sure what this one represents, and my research didn't help, but never mind. The Golden Age, published in 2014, is an excellent example of Australian fiction, having brought numerous literary awards to its highly regarded author, Joan London, a native of Perth, Western Australia. Close that picture now, Helen. Can you put the second one up, please?
Surely. It's for the book review.
Somebody's talking in the background.
Let's just remind.
I'm sorry? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't hear you, Helen.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so the story is set in Perth in the 1953-1954 timeframe. Much of it takes place in the Golden Age Children's Polio Convalescent Home, which really existed, located in the inner Perth suburb of Leederville. The picture here, the only one available, is its earliest iteration before it became the convalescent home, about which I will talk later. Close this picture now, Helen. We will come back to this shortly. In the early 1950s, Perth was a provincial city of some 350,000 people, unlike the glistening modern Perth of today, with a population of over 2 million, a bit larger than that of Jacksonville. Perth, on Australia's west coast, is some 3,000 miles from Australia's east coast population centres, such as Sydney, where I was born and grew up, and Melbourne. So why would I choose to review this book? As an Australian, I was drawn to the work because of my own polio experience in 1953, about which I'll talk later as it fits into the story, and to the fact that we lived in Perth for several years before moving to Jacksonville in 2004. At the same time, the author writes about events and the way of life which resonated with me. The story was believable. She was reminding me of my own childhood in the early 1950s. I was totally engaged by this authenticity. And why had Joan London written this? I watched and read interviews with her where she told of her need for seclusion in quiet in, quote, creative space, unquote, her backyard shed, to write. She said that as a baby boomer, she'd always been fascinated with hospitals and remembered lining up for the 2 polio vaccines, the Salk jab and the Sabin pink liquid in a little plastic cup. Some years later, I visited Dr. Albert Sabin and had a very nice meeting with him in Charleston, South Carolina. She recalled her and others' isolation as parents wanted to shield their children from the, quote, summer plague, unquote, of poliomyelitis, or infantile paralysis, as it was sometimes called, and the fear of the dreaded iron lung, in which I spent several weeks myself. She loved reading The Diary of Anne Frank, with its themes of hiding, fear, isolation, and young love in a closed world. These themes and feelings are prominent in the book, The Golden Age. Open picture number 2, please. And yeah, I've got somebody talking in the background there. I don't know what's going on, but anyway. Yes, thank you very much. The book opens with Frank Gold, the new boy, now in rehab from polio at the Golden Age, exploring in his wheelchair during rest time. He's looking for Elsa Briggs, but he can't find her. But this is not really the beginning of the story. It just sets the stage, as we don't read details about Elsa until several chapters later. Incidentally, the author's technique is to provide a taste of characters, switch to and fro between them as they develop, and move between locations. Initially, the author presents the characters to us very briefly with a short chapter of introduction, after which we begin to learn more about the characters as they re-enter the story in greater detail in subsequent chapters. This technique urges us to read on as their stories are revealed until we have a tapestry of interwoven lives coming together. Their stories are presented throughout the book with clarity, deftness, and importance in such a way that we can understand why they think and behave as they do. Again, isolation, being alone, and fear come through the stories. While Frank and Elsa may be the primary characters in the story, there are several other secondary ones and even a few tertiary characters. I use the words primary and secondary because I didn't want to label them major or minor characters. Frank is on the cusp of adolescence, nearly 13 years old, and has been moved to the Golden Age from the infectious disease branch of Royal Perth Hospital, so he can be with kids more his size and age. He's both small and underdeveloped for his age. We are also introduced to the slightly younger Elsa. Both are at the Golden Age because their parents work and can't look after them. It turns out that the Golden Age, as you see in this picture here, and which did exist, as I mentioned, was once a pub in Leederville, 2 train stops from downtown Perth, and was converted to a convalescent home in 1949 until its closure 10 years later. Of course, this photograph, which is the only existing picture there is of when it was actually a pub, not when it became the convalescent home. It was not a dreary place, but was outfitted to be cheerful with lots of attention given by staff to the children's comfort, rehabilitation, and education. And here, also in a wheelchair, is Elsa, who spends time with the very young children in the baby's room, their tiny bodies in splints. Close this picture, please, now. Helen, thank you. The part of the book I found fascinating was the story of Frank and his parents. We are now in Vienna, Austria, where we are introduced to the Hungarian refugee family of Maya and Ida Gold and their son, Ferenc, later changed to Frank. We are not told they are Jewish, but we can guess. As refugees, they are living in a dorm in Vienna after the war and applied to go to the USA and Australia. Their sponsorship to Western Australia is offered and accepted first. When they arrive in Perth, on one of the many migrant ships bringing almost 1 million people from Europe to Australia from the period 1946 to the late 1960s, Ida immediately wants to go home. She was shell-shocked by the attitudes of 1946 Australians towards them. They're new immigrants. New Australians, they are called, a description which was in use for decades. And if in her mind things could not get any worse, it is now 1953 and her son, Frank, has polio. Next picture, please, of the boy, iron lung. Frank has a new vocation, a poet. We are back in the infectious disease branch of Royal Perth Hospital, where Frank is before he's transferred to the golden age. He is the kid. Here are rows of patients in iron lungs, similar to what you see here. You can see the boy's head lying down and his reflection in the mirror in this iron lung. They were described as ghostly coffins and submarines by the writer. Yes, and I was in one of those. This reminded me of my own experience. Here, in the infectious disease branch, he meets 18-year-old Sullivan Backhouse, who writes poetry in his mind or scribbles it on a prescription pad inside the lung. Sullivan writes rhymeless poetry and inspires a new form of poetry writing by Frank. This will last a lifetime. Sullivan tells Frank of the day polio attacked him, the boy, Sullivan, who had everything. Sullivan seemed to get better, but one morning, Sullivan and his iron lung were gone. He had died in the night. This part of the story resonated with me as if it were yesterday. It was believable. It was authentic. Close the picture, please. It's not until chapter 7, The Trains, that we learn more details about 1944 Budapest, Hungary, where Frank and his mother are living. Budapest is already occupied with the Nazi cohorts, the Arrow Cross, looking everywhere for Jews. Frank's father, Meyer, is in a labor camp in occupied Ukraine. There is an excellent and dramatic and suspenseful description of Ida taking 3-year-old Frank, dressed as a little girl, to her music teachers to be hidden. It is Ida's giftedness that allows her to ask Julia, her music teacher, to save her son. Ida could have been the toast of Budapest. She was, after all, the star pupil at the Liszt Academy. Again, isolation, quiet, hiding, and the fear which is everywhere are paramount. To protect her identity, or to try to, Ida has changed her name to Teresia Bala, a Christian-sounded Hungarian one. I will read the author's words from the book. In 1941, through an old friend from the Liszt Academy, she'd had a job playing the piano one afternoon a week in the famous tea room of the Gellert. I'll just interject here. The Gellert is the grande dame of hotels in Budapest, magnificent for decades, still lovely, and we're very fortunate we've been there, so I can attest to that. Back to the quotation. One day, a waiter delivered a note to her, written in an unknown hand. "They're going to take you," it said. She put it down the front of her dress, her face demure, and broke into a sunny Strauss waltz. To warm applause, she rose and gaily holding up 5 fingers to indicate the length of her absence, she bowed and slipped out, coatless and unpaid, through the kitchen entrance, across the bridge, across the Danube, back into Pest, the part of Budapest where she was living. Quite scary. There are beautiful descriptions of Budapest in the book, and reminiscent of the diary of Anne Frank, the mandatory quiet by Frank Gold, who for hours must hide and not move in his secret location in Julia's home. She had students coming to her home often. One can hardly imagine how a 3-year-old could be so disciplined. This is reminiscent of Frank's days and nights in the Iron Lung. And when the Russians circled the Germans in Budapest in 1944, somehow Frank and Ida get out of Budapest and go to Vienna, some 150 miles away, we're not told how, and Maya reappears in the story. One afternoon, back at the Golden Age, Frank hears another new Australian family of Italians who are visiting their son, little Fabio. Frank sees them as smartly dressed Europeans, talking of eating dolce and gelati, which were totally unknown in Australia at the time. He missed this. It reminded him of cosmopolitan Vienna. After they left and the place felt silent again, he was struck by the silence and loneliness. His parents had not come. One boy, Warren Barrett, teased him, maybe bullied him, about not knowing all about famous Australian cricketers. He was making no progress on his poetry. He sets off in his wheelchair to visit Nella, the cook, in the kitchen. I'll read another quote from the book. He thought he'd visit Nella to check out what there was for tea. Let me just interject what that meant. That didn't mean afternoon or high tea. That meant like a light dinner or light supper. It's an Australian expression that's used for that sort of a meal. Back to the quotation. It always paid to make friends with the cook, wherever you might find yourselves. As he passed the girls, he saw in there a girl in a wheelchair, her head listening towards the last rays of the sun. Looked like she was alone. He didn't seem to notice anybody else. Her legs were long. She was tall. Tall as a small woman. She was wearing a dress of blue and white stripes with a wide white collar. Her arms were thin and straight. On her left calf, he glimpsed a caliper or splint below her hem, and her right foot was in a plaster cast. Her light golden brown hair was pulled back and little gold wisps escaped. She looked like a drawing done with a fine lead pencil. He noted the straightness of her nose, her delicate mouth, the length of her neck, the hollow of her throat. There was a shadow between her eye and cheekbone, an aristocrat, unquote. In my opinion, that is the most magnificent description, and which certainly I can imagine exactly know how Elsa would have looked. And this was the first time Frank sees Elsa. Everything is fresher, clearer, and he's even brought to tears. He hears the soft rain and jet outside. Now the golden age had mystery and glamour, writes the author. Sister Olive Penny is the senior nurse. Sister is an expression that was used for decades to describe the senior nurse of a ward or a floor or even a small hospital or hospital clinic. It's not really used very much today at all. I wondered when I saw Sister Penny whether this had something to do with the real life Sister Kenny, a famous Australian nurse who developed new ways of treating and rehabilitating polio patients. And her story was actually made into a Hollywood movie with the famous actress Rosalind Russell back in the 40s. But no, that was just a coincidence that there was no relationship between Sister Penny and the real life Sister Kenny, according to Joan London. We heard Sister Penny's story. She's a war widow with a young daughter. She's on night duty and makes a cup of tea. A policeman comes to see her, a regular visit, it seems, and makes love to her. The author describes this with great taste. Don't forget Sister Penny. Her story is not finished. We must continue turning the pages. Daily activities are described. Mondays to Fridays, the children are in the schoolroom. Day students come in by ambulance. The teacher, Mrs. Simmons, shuttles between girls' and boys' wards as they sing Australian songs in harmony. Social studies was challenging for Frank. He had to learn about Australian literature and the kings of England because Australia was part of the British Empire. Frank's eyes would light up when Elsa arrived. Therapy took priority over schooling, and children would go in and out all day to therapy. And my experience with schooling while in an iron lung was quite different, as my mother would read my lessons to me as I was lying in that iron lung. Lydia, the physical therapist, or as she would be called in Australia, physiotherapist, sometimes frequently the name is changed to physio. So Lydia, the physio from the treatment room, is also a new Australian, and Frank can relate to her. The kids learn how to walk with her as she guides them to being normal. They love her. Now the focus is on Maya Gold. One afternoon, he walks across the Swan River in Perth, intending to go home. I will read another quote from the book. As he crossed the causeway, he felt a lift in his heart, like a boy's cap thrown into the air. For what? For himself. He saw watermelon clouds piled up above the dark breast of the river, and he smelt the weedy flow of its depths. A freshwater breeze found him and, like a puppy, licked his face and neck, breathed cool life back into him. Water and summer evenings, ghosts of the past. The natural world, which was all he allowed himself to miss. Balaton, the lake, childhood, his brothers. He always felt better near the water. And of course, this reminds him of Lake Balaton, which some of you may have visited. I have not been there, but it's a very popular resort area in Hungary. And this is eventually where he meets Ida. So the memory of romance and Lake Balaton recurred during the story. It's a beautiful description. But then with this beauty, he imagines Perth in rubble, like wartime Budapest, with his visions of his murdered brother. Why was he, a Jew, here, he asks himself. We don't know the answer. He doesn't answer either. Instead of going home from work after crossing the river, Maya detours to the Golden Age, where Frank proudly tells him, I took 3 steps today. On his way out, Maya sees the quote unquote glamorous Sister Penny. They chat. He gets a thrill inside as they politely say goodnight to each other. I wondered where the author was going with this. I'd have to read on. Elsa's mother, Margaret, comes to visit. Elsa is reading Anne of Green Gables. My mother read it to me when I was in that iron lung. I adored it, and I finished all the Anne books after I left the hospital. Christmas 1953 has come. The city kids go home. Maya and Ida volunteer, like good Jewish people, at the Golden Age on Christmas Day to help the staff, explaining to all how their religion did not celebrate Christmas. I'll read you a quote, and poor Frank is a little bit uncomfortable about all of this. Frank was apprehensive about this exposure, the invasion of one world by another. He felt uneasy, as if Ida and Maya might break into Hungarian songs or reveal their critical attitudes to Australia, or their un-Australian fits of passion or melancholy, or serve up something foreign like pickled fish, or smoke too many cigarettes. Also, Frank overhears an interchange of conversation between his father and Warren Barrett. Remember the young boy who teased him or bullied him about not knowing who the cricketers were? What? He heard Warren Barrett say to Maya, who was hanging up balloons above the long wooden table, don't you believe in Jesus? Frank left the room. Now, I was wondering if this was a subtle sign of anti-Semitism, or perhaps it was simply just a curious young boy's wonder about a religion that he didn't know anything about. I'll have to think about that one. At the Christmas concert, Ida is invited to play Christmas songs. She plays Silent Night and Jingle Bells, among others. No one knows she was once a leading pianist in Hungary and could have been world famous. When Sister Penny hears Ida play and asks her to play some other pieces, she has a brainwave and thinks of a fundraiser concert by Ida in celebration of the pending royal visit to Perth in March 1954. Excuse me. The Australian summer in December, the reverse of the Northern Hemisphere, is here and Perth is suffering an excruciating heat wave. There's no air conditioning then, and the kids can go outside to the veranda after 6 o'clock. They feel they have a halfway existence, half inside and half outside, as the children from across the street stare at them. We also hear of the beautiful little part Chinese girl, Anne Lee, from the outback of Western Australia. A day's outing to the seaside is planned. A former church summer camp next to the sand is perfect. Kids could lie down and rest inside, and when outside, they're carried to the beach and into the Indian Ocean. The waves and water are refreshing. A whole day's worth of cure, writes the author. And Frank was inspired to write. Elsa was here too. When he sees or is with Elsa, he's invigorated, inspired, and writes. Are they in love or simply loving each other? This happens over and over throughout the book. Frank and Elsa were both born in 1941, and now sorry, I'm just looking for my part of the book to give you a quote here. And now they are teenagers. They are turning into something else. And as they talk about this, their hands brush each other, and there's a big thrill with the two of them. While the kids are at the seaside, Maya visits Sister Penny at the Golden Age and has a drink with her. Strange that she'd be drinking on duty, but that's what happened. He has a yearning for, quote, this incongruously beautiful woman in a polio hospital, unquote. Now, back at the Golden Age, the following day, tragic news comes. While on holidays and a week after her expected return, Lydia is reported drowned in a sailing accident with her husband. The children were told. Some said they shouldn't have been told. I think we can relate to that sort of an attitude. The feeling of being alone is here again. Everyone at the Golden Age had loved her. A temporary physio from Scotland takes her place. It's March 1954, the royal visit. There's great excitement. It's a momentous time. It was the same for me when Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh came to Sydney on their first royal visit to Australia. In Perth, the mass gathering of school children to greet the royal couple is cancelled because of the polio epidemic. However, the Golden Age kids were bused to the city to see the city's decorations. Maya and Ida Gold found all this quite amusing. They thought of the fate of the Austro-Hungarian monarchs back at the early part of the 20th century. Could you open picture number 4, please, Helen? Thank you. I'll read from the book. The Golden Age children were delivered by Mrs. Jewell in the ambulance to the roadside outside Princess Margaret Hospital for Children, where they joined other hospital patients already there. Was there a tiny hope that at this touching sight, the Queen would order the chauffeur to stop and she would descend like an angel to bless them, or at least offer them some special acknowledgement? The excitement when the black Daimler appeared behind its escort of police motorcycles was almost suffocating. As the car rolled past, the children sighted an arm in a long white glove, waving back and forward like something mechanical. A glimpse of that youthful smile, gleaming teeth in the shadows, the stern outline of the Duke's profile. All the children cried out, "Hooray, hooray!" Even though Frank, who had no ancestral feelings for Her Majesty at all, joined in, unquote. Look at the white gloved hand waving, and I will tell you, this mechanical white gloved hand was all I saw when the Queen came to Sydney and she was taken to see tens of thousands of school children. That was the only thing. It was authenticity again in the book. I lived it, I knew, I saw it. Thank you. Could you close that picture, please, and open the next one? the last one. At the same time, the March 1954 edition of Time magazine featured on its cover a portrait of the handsome, this is quoting from the book, handsome young Jewish doctor, Jonas Salk. And below him were the words, "Is this the year?" A year later, the announcement would flash across the world that it had indeed been the year that his polio vaccine had proved to be successful. The children's summer plague would soon be something of the past, unquote. We can close that. Thank you. With Ida's fundraising concert in honor of the royal visit, she now takes center stage. Ida practiced like she had not done for years. She chose the program, replete with classical works. Maya felt excited like when he first met her. The concert would be a thank you note for Frank's recovery. It was also her revenge on fate. While she didn't appreciate the Australian national anthem, which at the time was God Save the Queen, and which she played, Frank said, "It's our anthem now, Mum. Australia's our home." She was an émigré artiste, elegant and slim, in a form-fitting blue-black taffeta gown, designed and made by local Jewish dressmaker Dora Fink, who once worked for a famous Vienna couturier. Her playing enthralled the audience and even the neighbors across the street. Ida was again the toast of the town, but this time in Perth. This was, to me, the apogee of the book, before things seemingly started to go downhill at the Golden Age. For Sister Penny, nothing had gone right since this triumphant night, a night of triumph for Ida and her beautiful playing, and a triumph for Sister Penny, whose idea for the concert it had been, and who had raised the princely sum of £40 for the home. 3 events happen and move quickly in succession. Firstly, one of the boys, Albert Sutton, decided to escape in his wheelchair, somehow climbing the fence outside the Golden Age, falling down the hill on the other side, with his wheelchair falling on him, breaking his leg until he was discovered next day. New rules are imposed at the Golden Age. The doors are now locked at 6 p.m. sharp. They had never been locked before. Secondly, Anne Lee, the part Chinese girl, Anne Lee's father, shows up and announces he's taking her home to their outback town, even though Sister Penny begs him not to do so and to please let her stay because she's not ready to leave. Anne and her father leave without doctor's permission. Sister Penny's optimism is diminished and she feels a, quote, general sense of loosening, unquote. At her shift's end, she leaves the hospital in charge of less experienced nurse, Hadley Dent. We wonder, is Sister Penny heading out of town to the outback to try to rescue and bring back Anne Lee? We don't know. Next morning, from a friend's home, Sister Penny calls the Golden Age to check up. Thirdly, a dramatic event occurs that changes the lives of our characters forever. But you'll have to read the book to find out this spoiler. The drama picks up tempo and is suspenseful. The themes of isolation, loneliness, and fear continue. Frank is now home from school. It's the school holidays, and he's home alone. He walks with a stick and can go to the state library by tram. There, with the help of the librarian Shirley, he reads all the poetry books he can find. He also finds a book shop in downtown Perth that sold the poetry books he loved and craved. He's about to start high school at prestigious Perth Modern School, Perth Mod, on a scholarship. By the way, Perth Mod is still very prestigious in Perth. He continually thinks of Elsa, but when he phones, he's told, oh, the family have gone overseas. Ida is reminded that now Frank is 13 and there is his bar mitzvah class. Nothing further is written in the story about this, so we don't know if he ever has a bar mitzvah. I felt like we were heading rapidly toward the denouement climax of the various stories. Maya, who drives a soft drink company truck, looks for Sister Penny at her home near the beach. She didn't tell him where she was living, but he has a hunch. He sees her on the street in a wet swimsuit. She'll be leaving for a new job in Darwin, in the remote north of Australia. He imagines they are at a cafe at Lake Balaton in Hungary. Again, the romantic aura of the lake. They talk about Frank and Elsa, but having run out of conversation, they say goodbye. Quote, "There was once a spark, but it disappeared," unquote, writes the author. With Frank lonely, Ida decides to call Elsa's mother Margaret. Seems that Elsa and the family didn't go overseas after all. Margaret and her husband Jack invite the Gold family to afternoon tea. Visitors are rare at the Briggs home, especially exotic European ones. Polite conversation takes place. We hold our breath at the gathering. Ida brings a cake. It's a lovely description, which I think will probably make you feel a bit hungry. Quote, "Margaret bravely cut into the cake that Ida had brought. Everybody took a piece. Something changed then, a brightening that was visible as the consolations of chocolate and brandy, coffee, cream and vanilla, of meringue and fine egg sponge appeased the spirit of each one of them. The Briggs family had never tasted anything like it. An Austrian tart from Klein, the Jewish baker in North Perth," the Gold said, "as good as anything in Vienna." And to himself, Jack, Elsa's father, is wondering, "I wonder how Meyer could have afforded this very expensive cake. It must have cost a fortune when he only drove a van." We don't know. He just thinks that to himself. Now we're going to come to what I think is actually a funny part of the book, if you can imagine. Whilst they're sitting there politely having their afternoon tea, it starts to rain. And Margaret says, "Oh, it's raining. We all must go out quickly now and get the washing off the line." I have to tell you, there were no clothes dryers in those days in Australia. And even today, there are very few. So this was not unusual. But this was a great excuse for Elsa, who thinks of something wonderful here. Elsa knew she had to get Frank away, as I quote from the book. While the others milled around the washing line, she headed out through the flimsy yellow grasses and the foliage to the back of the garden, where there were 2 wooden fruit crates. Nobody could see you. They used to call it the den. Just as the light broke out, Frank came ploughing after her. For a moment, the grasses shone silver like ashes. Now he was with Elsa. A calm descended over him. Everything was happening as it should, he thought. The thick strings of leaves around them, enclosing them in the thickening darkness, flickering darkness. With a long sigh, they put their arms around each other. They fell at once into the fit of each other's body. But even in Elsa's arms, her face against his, Frank's body started to shake and sweat. He knew they couldn't stay there. He was right. They couldn't stay there. So they headed back in to the house to rejoin the family inside for what might have been the last time. We don't know. Now the concluding chapter of the book. 50 years pass. Frank is in New York City, a successful poet, but, quote, "an old man with a cane," unquote. Elsa's son, Jack, founding editor of an Australian literary magazine specializing in poetry, comes to interview him. He tells Frank about his mother, Elsa, now a retired physician in Adelaide, South Australia. Frank tells Jack that he qualified as a school teacher and was sent to the West Australian goldfields town of Kalgoorlie. Outer Siberia, he called it because of its remoteness. Coincidentally, Kalgoorlie, outer Siberia, Kalgoorlie was where my father was born. So there was something there, and very remote, I have to tell you that. Frank has sent Elsa his books over the years, but she never wrote back. Frank reminisces, the marvelous Sister Penny, the death of his parents who died within weeks of each other and were buried the next day according to the Jewish religion. In the quote, "In the earth my father had come to love," unquote, says Frank. Because of time and distance, Frank could not attend their funerals. In New York, he had cared for a little girl, the daughter of a friend who caught TB. He had also fallen in love a few times and loved others. For my last quote and last reading from the book, here's a passage which I think captures the essence and theme of the work. How easy it is to love a child, even one who is not your own, he thought. And suddenly he was overtaken by memories of the golden age, again, after all these years, of the corridor and the veranda, and the flocks of wheelchairs, and the affection of the nurses and Sister Penny, of Nella, Lydia, and a Scottish physiotherapist. Polio is like love, Frank says, a little abashed because he has pronounced this before, often, and in at least 2 poems. Years later, when you think you have recovered, it comes back, unquote. Frank inscribes 6 of his poetry books for Jack, and Jack is farewelled and goes. I have some final thoughts. Missing from the story. Where did Ida live in Budapest, and how did she avoid capture in wartime Budapest, even though she changed her name? She'd been famous as a young pianist and surely would have been recognized. How did Maya reunite with her, and where? Was it in Budapest or Vienna? What about Frank's bar mitzvah, which I already mentioned? And what made Frank go to New York? I agree with Australian literary critic Tegan Bennett Daylight in the October 31st, 2014 Sydney Review of Books, who expressed disappointment in this ending. She wrote, I quote, "I certainly hated seeing Frank surrounded by the trappings of the 21st century. It felt like a misstep, a change in tone too abrupt, a surrender to the reader's curiosity when perhaps the reader ought to be left in that lovely suspended state in which Frank and Elsa find themselves in the penultimate chapter," unquote. In the end, though, it is a beautiful work. For me, the characters were engaging, believable, and authentic. I saw so much of myself and my life in the story, growing up in Australia, living in Perth, my own polio experience, and events of the period. Australia is a nation of avid readers and with a rich literary history. I believe Joan London's The Golden Age is a fine work, a worthy classic to be added to the ranks of modern Australian literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carole. That was really lovely.
Thank you.
I want to read it. And I'm going to open up for anyone who may have a question. You can just, it's probably easier to just unmute yourself and ask the question. And we would, I think that would work out good. We did have someone ask about Joan London. We know a different Joan London in the United States in the television world, and someone wanted to know if that was the same one.
No, it isn't. That's the United States one is L-U-N-D-E-N. This one's L-O-N-D-E-N. So no, different one. And incidentally, Joan London is her married name. Her husband's Jeff London, an architect.
Sounds like you've been asked that one before.
I have, and I asked it too.
Any other questions? Georgia? Just unmute yourself.
There we go. Carole, do you know if the author had a personal connection to polio? Any of her family members or anything like that?
I saw an interview with her that was made, and somebody asked a similar question, and she did not have anybody who had polio that she actually knew. She had the personal connection with the vaccine, remembering getting both the Salk jab and the Sabin vaccine, but she said, no, I did not have such a personal experience.
And do you know if there are other facilities like those in Perth for the children?
Well, this was back in the early 50s, of course,
Right.
until 1960. I would think there are facilities for children with other issues, but for all intents and purposes, other than say in Afghanistan or Pakistan, polio has been eradicated, so they don't have that sort of thing anymore.
Right, right. I just didn't know because you talked about being an iron lung yourself. I guess that was in Sydney.
Right, that was in the hospital. And the Golden Age was a convalescent home that they had in Perth for children after they were released and transferred from the infectious disease branch of Royal Perth Hospital. When I was in hospital with polio, they didn't have such facilities in Sydney. Good questions.
May I ask a question? I thought your review was very interesting and certainly makes me want to look further into the book. Might I say, I had no idea, Carole, that you yourself had ever experienced polio. And I'm so happy to see your beautiful life that you've had after having such an experience.
Well, thank you very much, Eve. Yes, very few people knew about that. Occasionally, doctors will ask me certain questions and I tell them, you know, I had polio when I was a child, and they say, oh, well, then that explains why you're having this issue with that. But fortunately, I was one of the lucky ones. Sadly, my next door neighbor's father in Sydney, when I was growing up, he contracted polio and whilst I was in hospital, and he passed away also very quickly. There weren't that many elderly people, and he was older, who had it. It seemed like mostly children, and I knew a lot of other children who had it as well. Yes.
Sophia?
Yes, my question is about the iron lung. I am not really, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm not familiar, but I have never seen it. What was really the reason? Is it for compression of the lungs to take more oxygen in? Can you explain a little bit?
Well, I don't know all the technicalities, but that's a good question. And from what I understand, even today with the COVID and the shortage of respirators, and sometimes the iron lung was referred to as a respirator, they had tried to resurrect some iron lungs for today's COVID sufferers when there was a shortage. But yes, it was to try to get the air, you know, the oxygen in. And in my case, I didn't have polio in my arms and legs. I had polio in my throat. And so I had tubes that went through my nose, down through my throat and then went down further. And that's also how I was fed as well, by liquids. For about 3 weeks, I was in that iron lung like that.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Karen?
One of the most vivid scenes for me, I love the book. And by the way, it's available on Hoopla, so you can download it today and you don't need to go to the library, was the nurses running when the power went out. And the nurses ran down and started pumping the iron lungs because the children in them would have suffocated if they could not make the oxygen go to them. It was just an amazing scene.
Well, I didn't experience that. And as I say, I was in Sydney, actually, at the Children's Hospital, the Royal Alexandra Hospital for Children, as it was officially called. And I was in the iron lung there, and I don't ever remember, thank goodness, the power going out. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was quite something, quite an experience. Any other questions?
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Am I unmuted? I just wanted to say, first of all, Gloria, your introduction was really great. And you put a lot into that one. Carole, you have so much going for you and so many talents. And besides baking great cakes yourself, I really am surprised. I had no idea you had polio. If you told me, that went right by me. So I'm glad you told us about your experiences, but I also learned a lot of the local culture, sort of. I never knew much about polio times, and I thank you for bringing us to it and also taking us through Australia and Hungary, etc. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks very much, Ellen. Yes. Well, I could probably talk about my experience in the iron lung and in having polio and how I got it and how it was discovered and how it was what happened. But that would be another story. That would probably take me a good hour to tell you all about it. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you once again, Carole, for sharing your story, for sharing Joan London's story, and for getting this summer's book reviews off to such a great start. I hope everyone will join us next Tuesday, the 13th, when Jill Weisberg. Jill, want to wave if you're there? Jill Weisberg is going to be reviewing The World That We Know by Alice Hoffman. And we're looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much to everybody, and thank you to Helen for helping me with the pictures.
Thank you, everybody. Happy reading.
Thank you. Bye.
Stay dry and stay safe.